She was one of the most powerful women on the planet. He was the man setting up folding chairs before dawn. When her swimsuit strap snapped at the edge of the resort pool and left her completely exposed, every instinct she'd developed over a decade of boardrooms told her what was about to happen next. The stare, the smirk, the leverage. Instead, he turned his back. No hesitation, no performance, just a quiet, immediate choice that cost him nothing and somehow meant everything. By the time the desert sun rose over the ridge, Vanessa Sterling would realize she had just met the most remarkable man she'd ever encountered, and he had no idea. Drop your city in the comments and give this story a like. Let's see how far this one travels. The alarm on Mason Reed's phone went off at 4:15 in the morning, same as every other day, and he silenced it before it had a chance to wake Eli. He lay still for a moment in the dark of his hotel room, not the kind of room the guest stayed in, not even close, listening to his son breathe from the other bed. Eli was 7, and he slept the way only children could sleep, completely surrendered to it, one arm thrown out sideways, mouth slightly open. Mason watched him for a few seconds longer than necessary. It had become a habit over the past 3 years, this quiet checking, a reflex left over from the harder months when sleep hadn't come easily for either of them. He got up without turning on the lamp. He moved through the room by memory. Bathroom, sink, cold water on his face, 2 minutes brushing his teeth, the specific sequence of putting on his uniform without making noise. Black slacks, pressed white shirt, the lanyard with his contractor ID that he'd left on the nightstand. He tied his shoes sitting on the edge of the bathroom floor so the bed wouldn't creak. Before he left, he went back to Eli's side of the room. He straightened the blanket, tucked it loose around the boy's shoulder. Eli always overheated if you tucked too tight. And set the extra keycard on the nightstand next to the small flashlight, the habit snacks, and the note he'd already written the night before. Morning, bud. Don't touch the hotel phone unless it's an emergency. There's a granola bar and a juice box in my bag. I'll be back by 8. Be good. Dad. He read it once, even though he'd written it, then let himself out. The Meridian Grand stood at the edge of the Sonoran Desert like something that had no business being there, which was probably the point. 63,000 square feet of sandstone and glass and landscaped impossibility, the kind of resort that charged guests more per night than Mason made in a week and delivered on the promise just enough that nobody complained. Infinity pools that looked out over 100 miles of open desert, a spa built into the natural rock face, corridors that were kept 10 degrees cooler than the air outside and smelled faintly of juniper, and something Mason could never quite identify. He'd worked 3 events here in the past 2 years. He knew the property well enough to walk it in the dark, which he was doing now, cutting across the staff walkway that ran behind the east wing, past the delivery dock where a kitchen crew was already unloading crates, past the groundskeeper's shed, through the fire door that opened into the lower conference wing. His company, Clearfield Event Systems, had been contracted to design, install, and manage the technical infrastructure for the Sterling Global Leadership Forum. 3 days of keynote addresses, panel discussions, breakout sessions, and a closing gala, all attended by roughly 400 of the highest-paid executives in the technology sector. It was a significant contract, the kind of contract that kept 6 people employed for another quarter. Mason had overseen the initial setup 2 days ago and had been on site since, doing the kind of pre-dawn work that happened before anyone of importance was awake. He unlocked the main conference hall and went in. The room was big enough to seat 500 with room to breathe. Curved rows of chairs faced a stage that Mason's crew had spent 9 hours building. Modular risers, custom lighting rigs, dual projection screens, a center podium with a clear acrylic front that had taken 2 attempts to install correctly because the resort's electrical team had run the wrong gauge cable on the first pass. That had been a fun conversation. Mason had handled it the way he handled most problems, without raising his voice, without blaming anyone publicly, by just finding the person who could fix it and making sure they had what they needed. He walked the perimeter of the room now, checking each of the 8 speaker clusters mounted along the side walls, pressing the test button on his handheld unit and listening to the tones. 7 of 8 came back clean. The one in the far rear right corner was putting out a half-second delay on the high end, barely audible, but there. He climbed the 6-foot ladder himself rather than calling his crew at 4 in the morning, pulled the panel cover, Checked the connection at the back of the unit. The XLR connector on the secondary line had loosened, probably from the vibration when the resort's HVAC kicked on overnight. He reseated it, ran the test again. Clean. He climbed down, noted it on his tablet, moved on. The breakout rooms were off a long corridor to the north. 5 rooms, each with its own setup. Different configurations, different technical requirements. Room A was a traditional panel setup with a long table and 5 microphone placements. Room B was a round table discussion format with wireless lapel mics distributed to each chair. Room C through E were workshop spaces that needed both presentation capability and whiteboard integration with the digital capture system. Mason worked through each one methodically. He wasn't rushing and he wasn't dragging his feet. This was just the pace he worked at. Steady, complete, without the kind of performative urgency some people used to signal how hard they were working. He'd been doing this kind of work for 11 years. He'd started at 21, entry level, hauling cable and setting up podiums for a regional AV rental company in Phoenix. He'd learned the equipment, learned the engineering principles behind it, gotten certified, gotten better, moved up. 3 years ago, he'd taken the risk of going independent, forming Clearfield with 2 colleagues, and it had paid off. Slowly, without any dramatic turning point, just through doing the work well and enough people noticing. He didn't think of himself as particularly ambitious. He thought of himself as someone who finished what he started. By 5:45, he was done with the conference wing. He checked in with his crew chief, Darius, by text. All rooms green, rear right cluster had a loose connection, handled, and Darius replied with a thumbs up emoji and the coffee cup emoji, which was his way of asking if Mason had eaten yet. Mason had not eaten yet. He had a protein bar in his back pocket that he'd been meaning to get to for the past hour. He ate it now, standing in the corridor, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sky above the desert, which had just started doing that thing where the black gave way to a deep blue-purple that wasn't quite any color you could name. He had 45 minutes before his next commitment, a quick walk of the outdoor amphitheater stage with the resort's event coordinator, and he'd learned a long time ago to not waste those pockets of time trying to find somewhere to sit. He walked instead. He took the path that wrapped around the south side of the property, past the fire pits that the evening staff hadn't fully extinguished. He'd need to mention that to someone, and toward the recreation area that housed the resort's main pool complex. The Meridian Grand had 2 pools, a main leisure pool open to all guests, and the Founders Club pool, which was a separate, smaller facility reserved for guests staying in the resort's premium suites. Mason had no reason to go near either one. He was walking the outer path, which curved around the perimeter of the recreation area, separated from the pool decks by a low, decorative wall and a line of palm trees that looked slightly out of place this far into the desert. He heard the splash before he saw anything. Not a loud splash. Not the sound of someone jumping in or cannonballing or doing any of the things that suggested fun was happening. It was a single sharp sound, the kind made by someone entering water unexpectedly. A controlled fall, almost. The sound of a body that had slipped. Mason stopped walking. Through the gap in the palm trees, he could see the surface of the Founders Club pool, still mostly dark in the pre-dawn light, lit only by the underwater lights that the resort kept running all night on a timer. The water was moving in expanding rings from a point near the far edge. Someone was in the water. He looked for a head, found it. A woman, already rising from the surface, clearly a swimmer and not in distress, her body moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew what she was doing in the water. She reached the edge of the pool nearest to him, set her hands on the coping, and pushed herself up and out in one smooth motion. What happened next? Mason would later be unable to reconstruct with complete clarity, not because he hadn't observed it, but because his brain had made a rapid and instinctive decision about where to direct his attention, and the result was that he'd seen just enough to understand the situation before he deliberately stopped seeing anything at all. The swimsuit, a one-piece, dark-colored, clearly expensive, had not survived the fall intact. The impact with the water, or the force of her pulling herself out, or some combination of both, had caused the left shoulder strap to give way entirely. What had been a suit was now, on one side, significantly less than a suit. Mason turned around. He did it fast. Not slowly, not dramatically. Just the immediate physical act of rotating his body 180 degrees until he was facing the path he'd just come from, looking at the decorative wall and the grounds beyond it, and the lightning sky above the Sonoran desert. He heard the sound of her breath, quick and sharp. He heard the water dripping from her onto the pool deck. "Oh my," she started, then stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood there for a second, processing, and then he reached into his kit bag. He carried it everywhere on site, a worn nylon bag with a shoulder strap that held his tools, his tablet, spare cables, and a dozen other things he'd learned over the years to always have on him. And he unzipped the side pocket where he kept the emergency supplies. Every event tech he knew kept a version of this pocket. It had things like extra gaffer tape, a multi-tool, zip ties, spare batteries, aspirin, a compact first aid kit. It also had a clean folding towel. Not a pool towel, a compact microfiber one, the kind marketed to hikers and travelers. He'd bought a 3-pack at a drugstore in Tucson and kept one in the bag after a client event where someone had spilled an entire water pitcher on a projection screen and Mason had nothing to dry it with. He unfolded it now, held it out behind him at arm's length, eyes still facing the path. "There's a towel," he said. "Take your time." Silence. He waited. He heard her step toward him across the pool deck tiles. He felt the slight tug as she took the towel from his hand. More silence. The sound of her wrapping herself, adjusting, deciding. "You can turn around," she said finally. He did. She was standing about 4 feet away, the microfiber towel wrapped around her shoulders. She was tall, 5'9", maybe 5'10", with wet hair pulled back from her face, and the particular kind of posture that Mason associated with people who'd spent years being photographed. A straightness through the spine that persisted even at 5:50 in the morning after an involuntary pool entry and what had to be a genuinely mortifying moment. She was watching him, not with embarrassment exactly, more like someone running an assessment. Mason had seen that expression before, on executives, on senior engineers, on anyone who spent their professional life evaluating other people's competence. He didn't find it threatening or flattering. It was just an expression people made. "Thank you," she said. "No problem," he said. He meant it in the literal sense. It actually was no problem. He hadn't done anything that cost him anything. "You turned around very fast," she said. "Yeah." She tilted her head slightly. Most people wouldn't have. Well, Mason thought about that for a half second. Most people also wouldn't advertise that. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the precursor to one. Something that was considering the possibility of a smile. "Vanessa Sterling," she said. He knew the name. He would have known it even without having spent the past 4 days installing technical infrastructure for her conference. Vanessa Sterling was one of the most widely covered founders in the technology industry. 30 years old, the head of Sterling Global, a company she'd started at 22 with a concept for enterprise AI optimization software that turned out to be about 6 years ahead of the industry. She'd been on the cover of 3 major business publications in the past year. Her face was on the screensavers of about half the attendees currently sleeping in the premium suites above him. "Mason Reed," he said. "Event Systems, Clearfield. We're handling your conference setup." She looked at him for another moment, the assessment still running. "I usually swim at this hour because there's nobody out here," she said. There was something careful in the way she said it. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement that the situation had required a variable she hadn't planned for. "I was just cutting through," he said. "And now you have a wet towel. I've got 2 more. That almost smile again. A light came on in one of the upper floors of the resort, a single window somewhere in the premium wing, and both of them looked up at it instinctively, then back at each other. "The conference starts in a few hours," she said. "I know. I'll be there." He paused. "You probably should, too." She looked at him for just long enough that he wondered if he'd miscalculated the tone. Then she let out a short, quiet laugh, genuine, slightly surprised at herself, and nodded. "I should go," she said. She handed him the damp towel with a kind of directness that didn't try to make the gesture more than it was. "Good luck today," he said. She walked back toward the pool house access door, the route back to the private guest entry for the founder's suites. And Mason watched her go, not because of anything other than the basic human reflex of watching someone walk away, and then he turned back toward the path. He checked his watch, 32 minutes before his outdoor amphitheater walkthrough. He kept moving. At 6:15, the resort's kitchen began its service ramp-up for the conference breakfast, and Mason walked through the amphitheater with Claudia Reyes, the Meridian Grand Senior Event Coordinator. Claudia had been running events at this resort for 12 years and had the particular gift of identifying problems in the 10-second range. She walked into a space, saw what was wrong, and said it. Mason respected that. He dealt with event coordinators who performed concern without actually having any, and Claudia was not that. "Wind's going to be a factor this afternoon," she said, squinting at the desert horizon. The amphitheater was open air, facing west, with a natural rock formation along the rear that the architect had worked into the aesthetic. It looked spectacular. It also created unpredictable wind tunnels. "I've already adjusted the cardioid patterns on the outdoor mics," Mason said. "If it gets above 20 miles per hour, I might need to switch to the hypercardioid configuration, but we'll have time to make that call before the afternoon session." Claudia nodded, made a note on her tablet. "The gala's on the rooftop terrace tonight. Is that setup complete?" "Goes up at noon. I'll check it myself at 5 before the caterers come in." "Good." She looked at him sideways. "You're thorough." "I like to sleep at night." "Doesn't everyone?" She tapped something on her tablet. "Your crew chief, Darius. He's asking about lunch for the team." "Yeah, I'll sort it out." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Mr. Reed, there's a fully catered staff meal at 12:30. You and your crew are included. That's not a favor. It's in the contract. You're allowed to eat the food." Mason smiled. "Good to know." He had a tendency, which Eli had pointed out with characteristic 7-year-old directness about 6 months ago, of not remembering to ask for things that were already his. "Dad, you always tell me to use my words, but then you never use yours." He'd thought about that more than he should have. By 9 o'clock, the resort was running at full capacity. Guests were arriving for the first morning sessions, the conference hall was filling up, and Mason's crew was stationed at their positions. He moved between the technical stations, monitoring the signal feeds on his tablet, listening through his earpiece to the room tone. Vanessa Sterling took the stage at 9:15. Mason was at the rear of the hall when she walked out. He'd positioned himself there specifically, where he could see both the stage and the 3 screens simultaneously, watching for any technical issue that would require a rapid response. He had a clear sightline to the podium. She looked completely different. Not in the superficial way. She was wearing different clothes, obviously. Her hair was dry and styled. The difference was in something else, in the way she occupied the stage. She walked out without any visible warmth-up period, without the brief self-conscious adjustment that most speakers did, even experienced ones, in the 3 seconds between stepping onto a stage and beginning to speak. She just walked out there and started. "I'm going to tell you something that no one in this room is going to want to hear," she said. Her voice carried easily. She didn't need the podium mic to command attention, though she used it correctly, staying within the pickup range without being rigid about it. "Most of the people in this room are already obsolete. You just haven't caught up to that fact yet. And in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to explain exactly why that's the most important business opportunity you're going to encounter in your career." In the rear of the hall, Mason heard the shift in the room. That specific quality of silence that an audience produces when they've decided to pay attention. He watched the screens. The signal feeds were clean. The audio levels were sitting right where they should be. He listened, despite himself. She was a good speaker. Not in the rehearsed, polished way that a lot of executives were good speakers, where you could feel the prep work behind every transition. She was good the way someone was good when they actually believed what they were saying, when the urgency in the content was producing the urgency in the delivery rather than the other way around. She talked for 38 minutes. She answered questions for another 17. When she stepped off the stage, the room was different than it had been when she stepped on. Mason logged the session as technically clean, updated his crew on the schedule for the afternoon setup, and went to find Eli. His son was in the staff family room, a small lounge area near the loading dock that the resort had set aside for vendors' families, a courtesy that Mason had been genuinely surprised by when Claudia mentioned it. It had a television, a table, a window that looked out at the parking structure, and not much else, which suited Eli fine because Eli had brought his own things. The boy had spread a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be an elaborate underwater kingdom across the table, and was in the process of adding a mountain range to one corner with a red crayon. His snack bag was open beside him. He'd eaten the apple but left the cut carrots in a neat pile, which was consistent. "Dad," he said without looking up, "did you know the desert used to be underwater?" "A very long time ago, yeah. Hundreds of millions of years." Eli selected a blue crayon, considered it, put it back. "Do you think the fish ghosts are still here?" Mason pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "I think if fish ghosts exist, they've probably moved on." Eli seemed to find this acceptable. "Is your work going good? Going well?" "That's what I said." Mason let that go. "Work's going fine. How's the map?" "I'm adding a volcano." Eli looked up then, with the specific expression he made when transitioning from his interior world to the exterior one. A brief focusing, like adjusting to light. "Dad, there's a lady who works here and she gave me hot chocolate even though I didn't ask for it. I said thank you though." "Good, that was right." "She said I had nice manners." Eli considered this. "Do I?" "Usually." "What's the times when I don't?" "When you're tired and hungry at the same time." Eli nodded slowly, as though filing this information for future reference. "Okay." He went back to his volcano. "When do we go home?" "Day after tomorrow." "And then can we go to the thing? The thing with the trains?" Mason pulled out his tablet and checked his messages. "The model railroad exhibit. Yeah, it's on for Saturday." Eli made a quiet sound of satisfaction that he'd inherited, Mason was pretty sure, from his grandmother on his mother's side. A particular soft hum that meant the world had just organized itself correctly. It had nothing to do with Mason, which was fine. He'd take it. He sat with his son for 20 minutes, half working on his tablet, half listening to the detailed geopolitical history of the underwater kingdom, which had, it turned out, a complex and contentious relationship with the volcanic mountain range now being added to its border. He didn't think about Vanessa Sterling, or rather, he thought about her the way he thought about most things at the edges of his day, without committing to it, noting it, and moving on. He thought about the way she'd stood at the edge of that pool deck in the dark, wet and exposed, and clearly not accustomed to being caught off guard, and the way she'd run that assessment, deciding what kind of person he was. Not asking him, just watching and deciding. He'd met that type before. He didn't resent it. People earned that kind of caution in different ways. He thought about the laugh, the short, genuine one that had surprised her. Then his crew chief called with a question about the afternoon outdoor mic placement, and Mason stopped thinking about it. The first afternoon session ran from 1 to 3, outdoors at the amphitheater, and Claudia had been right about the wind. It came up at around 1:40, gusting from the southwest, pushing the ambient noise floor up significantly. Mason made the call to switch to the hypercardioid mics at the break, and Darius and 2 crew members made the swap in under 12 minutes, which was fast work in the heat. The desert in June was not a gentle environment. By 2 in the afternoon, the ambient temperature was 94 degrees, and the concrete and stone of the resort's outdoor areas were radiating additional heat upward. Mason drank water at a rate that still felt insufficient. He watched his crew do the same. He designated shade breaks every 40 minutes, and he enforced them without apology. Heat exhaustion on a job site was not a professional failure. It was a management failure, and Mason had enough professional failures cataloged in his memory that he was not interested in adding to them. He did his job. The afternoon sessions ran clean. At 4:30, he went back to the staff room to check on Eli, found him asleep on the couch with his arm over his face, the map completed and set carefully aside, the red crayon still in his hand. Mason sat down in the chair by the window and let him sleep. He ate a granola bar. He watched the parking lot. He thought about the drainage issue on their apartment building back in Phoenix that he needed to follow up on, and the permission slip he still needed to sign for Eli's end-of-year field trip, and whether the alternator noise in his truck was getting worse or whether he was just more aware of it since the mechanic had mentioned it. He thought about what it meant to be tired in the specific way that parents of young children were tired, The way it wasn't a crisis was just a kind of atmospheric condition, a baseline that you functioned within rather than something you fixed. He thought about the fact that he was good at his job, and he knew it, and it wasn't something he needed anyone else to confirm, and that this was one of the few areas of his life where the ground felt completely solid under his feet. Eli woke up at 5, looked at Mason, said, "Hi, Dad," in the flat voice of someone still mostly asleep, then rolled over and went back to sleep. "Hi, Bud," Mason said. By 5:30, he was on the rooftop terrace, walking the gala setup with Darius and one of the hotel's catering coordinators. The terrace was on the 4th floor, open to the sky, and in the late afternoon, the desert light was doing something spectacular. Long shadows, the horizon going copper and amber, the kind of sky that made people want to quote things. Mason observed it functionally, noted the wind direction, checked the wireless mic charging stations, confirmed the positions of the ambient speaker clusters. The gala was scheduled from 7 to 10. Black tie optional, which in practice meant about half the guests would be in formal wear and half would be in expensive casual clothes that they'd describe as smart. Mason had done enough of these to know the rhythm. Early cocktail hour, dinner service, a short post-dinner program, then open conversation until the resort staff started removing the drinks as a polite hint. His job tonight was to support the technical elements of the post-dinner program, a short presentation by Vanessa Sterling and a panel of 3 other executives, and then to monitor the ambient audio system through the end of the event. He'd arranged for Eli to have dinner with Claudia's assistant, a college student named Priya, who'd done event work for 3 years and had the practical competence of someone twice her age. Eli had decided immediately that he trusted Priya based on the fact that she'd asked him about his map without being condescending, and Mason had authorized the arrangement without worrying much about it. He was good at reading people. He'd had to learn to be. The gala began at 7 and ran well. The problem with running well events was that they required just as much active attention as running badly events, maybe more, because the temptation was to relax and then something slipped. Mason stayed at his station, monitoring, running his periodic checks. Vanessa Sterling gave her post-dinner remarks at 8:45. From where Mason stood, at the edge of the terrace near the ambient speaker stack, he had an oblique view of the presentation space, the back of the room, essentially, a sight line down the left side of the audience. He could see her profile. She was good again. Different material than the morning, shorter, more personal, less argumentative. She talked about the early years of building Sterling Global, the specific texture of not knowing if it was going to work, the way that uncertainty had felt different at 22 than it would feel now. She said it without self-deprecation and without bravado, just as a factual account of an experience she'd actually had. The panel followed and ran for 20 minutes, and then the program was over, and the event transitioned back into open conversation. Mason did his walkthrough, confirmed with his crew that everything was running on the automated system for the rest of the night, and was preparing to do his handoff when he looked up and found Vanessa Sterling standing about 10 feet away, watching him. Not the whole room assessment this time. Something more specific. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Ms. Sterling." She had a glass of something clear, water or something close to it, and she was holding it at chest height without drinking from it. She was in a dark dress that was not trying to do anything other than be a dress. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. Mason noted that it was phrased as a question. He noted that it seemed genuine. "Sure," he said. She moved toward the far end of the terrace, away from the main cluster of guests, where the railing ran along the edge of the roof and the desert spread out below and beyond in every direction, dark now and enormous, the distant lights of the highway like something floating. He followed. They stood at the railing for a moment without talking. The wind was calmer up here than it had been all day. Below them, the resort grounds were lit with the low amber lighting the landscape team used after dark, and beyond that there was nothing except the desert going out to the horizon under a sky that was doing its full nighttime work. Clear and enormous, the kind of star density you only got when you were this far from a city. "I looked you up," she said. Mason glanced at her. "Clearfield Event Systems," she said. 11 years in the industry, 3 years as a founder. Multiple references from clients who describe your work as, and I'm using their language, exceptionally reliable. She paused. You turned down a full-time senior position at Harmon Group 5 years ago. I did. Why? Mason thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I wanted to control my own schedule. She looked at him. Not for the reasons most people want to control their own schedules, he said. I have a kid. I needed to be able to make decisions about where I am and when. If I'm working for a company, that decision isn't fully mine. She was quiet for a moment. How old? 7? Is he here? Yeah. Something shifted in her expression. You bring him to work events? When I have to. I have good coverage for most of the time. There's a woman named Priya who's keeping an eye on him tonight. But at this age, if I'm away overnight, I take him with me when I can. She seemed to be turning this over. His mother? He didn't answer immediately, not because the question was offensive, but because he'd learned to gauge what kind of answer the situation called for. This one called for a straight one. She passed away 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Thank you. He meant it in the same way she'd meant the sorry, not as a ritual, just as an acknowledgement. They stood there for a moment in the gap left by that. What's his name? Eli. She nodded slowly. Does he like traveling for your work? He likes mapping things. Mason paused. Every place we go, he makes a map, not a real map. His own version of the place. What it would look like if he got to design it. He paused again, aware that he'd said more than he typically said, but not uncomfortable about it. He spent 3 days designing a better version of the Phoenix airport. It has more windows and a section specifically for dogs. Vanessa Sterling laughed again. It was the same laugh as the morning, short, genuine, slightly surprised at itself. A section for dogs, she said. He's made some compelling arguments for it. She turned back to the railing, looking out over the desert. I haven't talked to anyone like this in a long time, she said. It didn't sound like a complaint, or like she wanted him to say anything in response. It sounded like someone stating something plainly that they'd just noticed was true. Like what? He asked. Like you're just telling me things, not trying to sell me on anything. Mason looked at the lights on the horizon. I don't have anything to sell you. No, she said. I know. They talked for a while longer. He couldn't have said exactly how long. She asked him about how he'd gotten into event systems, and he told her the actual story, which involved an entry-level job he'd taken because it was the only one that was hiring and a natural aptitude for electrical systems that his high school electronics teacher had been the first to take seriously. She talked about the early years of Sterling Global, filling in the texture behind the conference stage version, the specific month when they'd run out of runway, and the thing that had saved them, which turned out to be not a funding round but a single enterprise client who'd signed a contract on a Tuesday that bought them 3 more months. It was a real conversation, not a networking conversation, not an interview, just 2 people standing at a railing above a desert, talking about things that had actually happened to them. At some point, Mason noticed the terrace had thinned out around them. The late-night guests were beginning to drift toward the elevators. The catering staff were making their initial moves to begin clearing tables. I should get back, he said. She nodded. He stepped back from the railing. Good luck with the rest of the conference. And you with yours, she said. Then, after a beat, how old is the dog section of the airport? 3 months. It's been through 2 revisions. She smiled. A real one this time, complete, no qualification. Tell Eli it's a good idea. Mason looked at her for a moment. I will, he said. He went back to work. Mason found Priya in the staff lounge at 9:40, sitting across from Eli, who had somehow produced a second map, this one of the resort itself, and was explaining to her in careful detail why the pool was in the wrong place. It should face east, Eli was saying, so you can see the sunrise while you swim. That's actually a really good point, Priya said, and she meant it, which was why Eli liked her. Mason stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed him. The overhead light in the lounge was too bright. It always was in staff areas, the fluorescence calibrated for function, not comfort. And it made both of them look slightly washed out, but Eli's expression was the specific one he wore when someone was genuinely engaging with him rather than managing him, and Mason was glad for it. Hey, Dad? Eli didn't look up from the map. Priya thinks the dog section is a good idea, too. Did you tell her it's been through 2 revisions? 3 now. Eli picked up a pencil and made a small addition near one corner. I added a water feature. Priya looked up at Mason with the expression of someone who had spent the past 2 hours being thoroughly educated. He's very thorough. Yeah. Mason pulled out his wallet, counted out what he owed her plus the extra he always added. She started to object, and he shook his head once. She took it. He gathered Eli's things, the maps folded carefully the way Eli required, the crayon case, the snack bag with its abandoned carrots, and they walked back through the resort service corridor to their room. Eli held his hand the whole way without thinking about it, which was something Mason knew wouldn't last forever and tried not to think too hard about. Was the work good? Eli asked. Work was fine. Did anything break? One thing, this morning. I fixed it. Eli nodded, satisfied. I finished the mountain range. I saw. The volcano is dormant, Eli said, but it could wake up. I haven't decided yet. Keeps your options open. Yeah. They got back to the room and Mason ran Eli through the routine. Teeth, face, the specific argument about whether pajama pants counted as real pants that they had some version of nearly every night, and that Eli won about 40% of the time through persistence alone. Mason drew the line at the pajama shirt because the resort kept its rooms cold, and Eli always forgot he was cold until he was already miserable. He sat on the edge of the bed until Eli's breathing evened out, which took about 4 minutes. The boy went under fast when he was genuinely tired, none of the stalling and negotiating that happened on nights when he'd had too much screen time or too much sugar. Mason sat there in the dark for a minute longer than necessary. He thought about the rooftop, not about Vanessa Sterling specifically, or not only about her, more about the texture of the conversation, the specific quality it had. He'd talked to a lot of people over the years at events like this, conversations that happened in the margins of the work, at loading docks and in service corridors, and at the back of conference rooms. Most of those conversations were fine. Some were good. Very few stayed with him past the drive home. He wasn't sure yet which category this one belonged to. He got up, went to the small desk by the window, opened his laptop, and spent an hour and a half finishing the technical report for the day's events. Signal logs, equipment notes, the crew time sheets, a brief write-up of the afternoon wind issue, and how it was resolved. He sent it to Darius and copied the client liaison. Then he closed the laptop, lay down on his side of the bed, and was asleep within 10 minutes. The second day of the conference started the same way the first had. 4:15. The alarm. The dark. Eli's breathing. The careful sequence of getting dressed without making noise. Mason was out the door by 4:30, moving through the resort's service routes with his kit bag and his coffee. He'd started making it in the room's small machine now, having accepted on day 1 that the staff break room's coffee was technically coffee in the same way that tap water was technically a beverage. And by 5, he was back in the conference hall, running his morning diagnostics. Everything was clean. The repairs from the previous day held. He moved faster through the checks, the way you always moved faster on day 2 when the space had stopped being unfamiliar. At 6:45, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. This is Vanessa Sterling. My assistant got your number from the event coordinator. The AV feed in my suite isn't working. I need to review the morning presentation materials, and the screen is showing no signal. Is this something your team handles, or should I call the resort's tech support? He read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because he was making sure he was reading it correctly. He texted back. That's resort infrastructure, not our system. But send me the room number and I'll find someone faster than the front desk will. A pause. Then, Suite 412. Thank you. He called the resort's technical services line directly. He had the number from the vendor contact sheet and talked to the overnight tech, a guy named Ben, who Mason had met on day 1 and who proved now to be efficient and mildly grumpy in equal measure. Ben said he'd be there in 15 minutes. Mason texted Vanessa. Someone will be there in 15. Her reply came back in under a minute. How did you do that faster than I could have done it myself? He smiled at his phone without particularly meaning to. I have the direct number, front desk routes to a queue. A longer pause this time. That's embarrassingly simple. Most things are, he wrote back, and then looked at what he'd written and wondered briefly if it read as condescending. He sent it anyway. No response. He put his phone away and went back to work. The second morning's keynote was delivered by a different executive, a man named Douglas Farr, the CEO of a logistics automation company, who had the kind of practice charisma that Mason recognized immediately as having been worked on. It wasn't false exactly, but it was assembled, each gesture and pause slightly too calibrated, the way something was when it had been run through a presentation coach too many times. The room responded to it well enough. Mason watched from the back and noted that the response was warmer on the left side of the audience and cooler on the right, which sometimes correlated with seating assignments and sometimes just meant that the right side hadn't had enough coffee. He spent the morning moving between rooms. In Room B, a roundtable on enterprise risk management ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time because two of the panelists turned out to have a genuine disagreement about something and stopped performing politeness around minute 20. Mason stood at the back and let it run, monitoring his levels, watching the two men talk over each other with the specific energy of people who'd been in the same industry for 30 years and had never actually said what they thought to each other's faces before. It was the most interesting session of the conference so far. He didn't see Vanessa Sterling until noon. She was in the hallway outside the main conference hall, standing to one side with a phone to her ear, and she was not happy. He could tell from 20 feet away, not loudly unhappy, not the performance of displeasure, but the particular stillness of someone containing something substantial while doing it in a professional context. Her jaw was set. She was listening more than talking, and when she talked, it was in short, precise sentences that he couldn't hear from this distance but could read the shape of. He walked past. She caught his eye as he did, briefly, the way you caught someone's eye in a hallway, and there was something in that quarter second that wasn't entirely professional acknowledgement. He wasn't sure what it was. He kept walking. He ate lunch with Darius and two of their crew, Tomas and a woman named June, who was the best cable tech Mason had ever worked with and who spent the entire lunch reading a novel she refused to tell anyone the title of, which had become a running joke by day 3 of any job she was on. "The lady running this thing was in the breakout hall this morning," Darius said, pulling apart a dinner roll. "Sterling, she watched you run the audio check." Mason looked up. "Not in a weird way," Darius said. "More like she was paying attention." "She's probably paying attention to everything. It's her event." Darius gave him the look. Darius had a specific look he deployed when he thought Mason was being deliberately obtuse, and it was a good look. Not aggressive, just patient. "Man, I'm just telling you what I saw." "Noted," Mason said. June turned a page without looking up from her book. The afternoon ran long. The outdoor session had to be moved inside at 2:30 when the wind came up again, harder than the previous day, carrying fine desert dust that would have gotten into the equipment. Mason made the call in coordination with Claudia, who had already been thinking the same thing, and they had the indoor overflow room reconfigured and operational in under 40 minutes. It was not a clean 40 minutes. It involved 2 crew members sprinting, one lighting rig that was more awkward to move than anticipated, and a 5-minute window where Mason was running cable himself while simultaneously directing Tomas on mic placement and answering Claudia's questions about sightlines. But it worked. The session started 12 minutes late. The presenter, to her credit, made a joke about the desert having opinions and moved on. After it was done, when the room was clearing and his crew was doing the initial breakdown, Darius put a hand on Mason's shoulder and said, "Good call, moving that in time." Claudia saw it coming too. "I know, but you moved first." Mason didn't say anything to that. He'd never been good at receiving that kind of thing, the specific acknowledgement of a decision made well. Not because of false modesty. He knew the call had been right, but because accepting it gracefully had always felt like something he was still learning. He checked on Eli at 4, found him watching a nature documentary on the room's television with focused intensity, a half-eaten apple in one hand, the map case open beside him, but apparently forgotten. The documentary was about deep-sea creatures, and Eli had questions. "Dad, do fish sleep?" "Yes." "How? They don't have eyelids." "They slow down and kind of hover. Their brain rests even if their eyes don't close." Eli considered this. "That sounds uncomfortable." "I don't think fish have a strong opinion about comfort." Eli looked back at the screen where something bioluminescent was doing something inexplicable in the dark of the ocean. Dad, if you could be any deep-sea creature, what would you be? Mason sat down on the edge of the bed. The one that doesn't know how deep it is? Eli looked at him. So it doesn't get scared, Mason said. Fish don't get scared the same way we do, Eli said, with the particular authority of someone who had been watching the documentary for 2 hours. I know. Eli seemed to decide this was acceptable and went back to the screen. Mason sat with him until 5, then went back to the rooftop to run his pre-gala checks. The second night's gala was smaller, a dinner for the conference's executive tier only, about 60 people, as opposed to the broader attendee event the previous night. The rooftop terrace again, but configured differently, with round tables instead of the long rows, the feel of it more intimate. Mason's crew was smaller tonight too. He and Darius and June running a streamlined setup, ambient sound, lapel mics for the evening's 2 speakers, a clean, simple system that didn't require the full rack. He was at the far end of the terrace, adjusting the second ambient cluster, when Vanessa Sterling came through the door from the elevator lobby. She was alone, which was unusual. At every other point in the conference, he'd seen her with at least 2 other people, either colleagues or the persistent orbit of whoever wanted 5 minutes. Now she crossed the terrace toward the railing with her arms crossed slightly against the evening air, which had dropped into the low 70s with the sun going down. Still warm by any reasonable standard, but the desert did its temperature swing fast and efficiently. She stopped about 10 feet from where Mason was working. The audio problem this morning, she said. The suite. He stepped down from the small equipment step he'd been standing on. Was it fixed? Ben was there in 12 minutes, she said. Loose HDMI in the back of the screen. 3 seconds to fix. Good. She looked at him with a kind of directness that he'd stopped finding startling somewhere during their rooftop conversation the night before. I spent 20 minutes on hold with the front desk before I texted you. 20 minutes. Resort tech support has a queue problem. I run a company with 800 employees and I couldn't get a TV fixed faster than you could with a text message. You have the wrong direct number, Mason said. She stared at him. I mean it practically, he said. Every building has a person who actually fixes things. They're usually not the person on the official support line. You just need to find out who they are. And how do you know who they are? You introduce yourself when you arrive. You learn their name. You treat them like a person and not a function. He paused. Ben was helpful because I talked to him like a human being on day 1, not because I had a special number. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Not the processing silence of someone offended. Something more genuine than that. She was actually thinking about what he'd said. Is that something you do deliberately? She asked. Mason thought about it honestly. Less deliberately than it used to be. She uncrossed her arms and came to stand beside him, not quite at the railing, still a few feet back from the edge. The sun was almost gone, the western horizon the color of something that hadn't cooled down yet, and the first few stars were becoming visible in the east above the desert. I looked up Clearfield more thoroughly this morning, she said, after I was awake enough to be properly embarrassed about the TV situation. He waited. Your client retention rate is exceptional for a company your size, she said. 89% over 3 years, that's not common. No. What do you attribute it to? He thought about the real answer rather than the professional one. The real answer was showing up when you said you would, fixing things without making the client feel bad about the fact that something needed fixing, and remembering that the people who hired you were usually dealing with more stress than they were showing. But that was a lot of words for something that mostly amounted to basic decency. We finish what we start, he said. She looked at him sideways. That's it? That's most of it. No secret to it? The secret is that most companies don't actually do that. So when you do, you stand out. The rooftop was beginning to fill around them, the 60 dinner guests arriving in the usual clusters, the catering team beginning its service rhythm. Mason was conscious of the fact that he had actual work to do, and that standing at the edge of the terrace talking to the event host was not, strictly speaking, it. I'll let you work, Vanessa said, reading the thing he hadn't said. She started to move back toward the tables. Ms. Sterling, She turned. "The phone call this afternoon," he said. "The one in the hallway. Are you okay?" She was still for a beat. "You noticed that?" "I wasn't trying to." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something that had layers to it, something that had been there for a while. "One of my board members wants to restructure the executive team," she said. "The timing is not ideal. Is it serious?" "It's manageable." A pause. "It's also none of your business." "No," he agreed. "I just asked." Something in her expression shifted again. The edge of it, the slight defensive tightening that had come in when she'd said none of your business, relaxed, like she'd regretted the reflex. "Thank you for asking," she said. He nodded once and went back to his equipment. The dinner ran cleanly. Both speakers were brief, which the room appreciated. The ambient system held. Mason moved through his monitoring with the specific low-key focus of someone doing a job they'd done many times, present to every detail without being tense about any of them. At 9:15, Darius texted him, "You're good to do your handoff whenever. June and I have the overnight." Mason ran his final checks, confirmed everything was on the automated system, and did the handoff at 9:30. He walked back through the resort service corridor toward the staff wing, kit bag on his shoulder, thinking about the drainage issue back in Phoenix, and the field trip permission slip, and the alternator noise, and the fact that Eli had eaten an apple without being asked today, which was a minor victory that deserved acknowledgement. He was almost at the staff elevator when he heard someone behind him. He turned. It was Vanessa Sterling, alone, no longer at the gala, her heels in one hand, walking on the service corridor floor in bare feet. He stared at her. "These tiles are cold," she said. "What are you doing back here?" "I left early." She looked at the corridor around her. The plain walls, the industrial lighting, the service carts parked against one side. "I've never actually been in the back part of a hotel before." Mason looked at her for a moment. "You need something?" "No." She seemed to be telling the truth. I was going to take the main elevator, and then I saw the service door and I thought." She stopped. "I don't know what I thought." "Okay." She looked down at the cold floor tiles under her bare feet. "You were right about Ben," she said, "and about the direct numbers, and about most things you've said, I think, which is slightly irritating." "Sorry." "Don't apologize, it's useful." She shifted her heels to her other hand. "Do you ever get tired of being sensible?" He thought about that. "Sometimes." "What do you do when you do?" "I go home," he said. "I sit on the floor with my kid and we build things out of whatever's available. Last month it was a fort out of couch cushions and the cardboard boxes from a kitchen appliance I bought. We spent 4 hours in it. He had opinions about the structural integrity of the window design." She looked at him. "The window design." He takes it seriously. A quiet moment in the service corridor, the fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights did. "I haven't built anything that wasn't professional in a very long time," she said. It came out plainly, the way things did when someone stopped deciding whether to say them and just said them. Mason didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure an answer was what she was looking for. "There's probably time for that," he said finally. She looked at him. Not the assessment, not the layers. Something simpler than that. "Probably," she said. She put her heels back on, standing on one foot briefly with the matter-of-fact balance of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, then straightened. "Good night, Mr. Reed." "Good night, Miss Sterling." She went back through the service door into the main corridor. Mason took the staff elevator up to his floor, let himself into the dark room, listened to Eli breathe, and stood there for a moment longer than he needed to before he sat down at the desk and finished his paperwork for the night. The last day of the Sterling Global Leadership Forum started with a problem. Mason got the call at 4:58 in the morning, 14 minutes after he'd arrived in the main conference hall, and 3 minutes after he'd discovered it himself. The primary DSP unit, the digital signal processor that managed the entire conference hall's audio routing, had thrown a fault error sometime between midnight and 5. The overnight automated system had logged it at 2:17 but hadn't flagged anyone because the fault was categorized as a non-critical warning rather than a failure. It was non-critical in the sense that the system hadn't gone down. It was critical in the sense that if Mason didn't resolve it before the 9 o'clock opening session, the hall's audio would be running on a degraded backup path that couldn't support the multi-zone output the final day's program required. He called Darius at 5:01. Darius answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been fully asleep, which meant he'd probably sensed something the way experienced technicians sometimes did about equipment they'd been working with for days. DSP fault on Unit 1, Mason said. I saw the log alert come through 20 minutes ago, Darius said. I was deciding whether to call you. What did you decide? That you'd already be up. Firmware issue or hardware? Could be either. Could be the temperature drop overnight. It went down to 62 in the hall when the HVAC overnight mode kicked in. These units don't love that. Mason was already pulling the rack panel. Get here when you can. I'm going to try the clean reboot first. He did the clean reboot. It took 8 minutes, during which the hall's audio system was completely offline, and Mason stood in the dark of the empty room waiting and not doing anything performative about the waiting, just standing there with his arms crossed and his eyes on the status lights. The unit came back up. It ran its self-diagnostic. It threw the same fault. He called the manufacturer's technical line, which had a 24-hour support option because they sold to broadcast facilities that didn't operate on business hours. The technician who answered was clearly running on the tail end of a night shift, but knew the product, and between them they worked through the diagnostic tree in about 20 minutes. The verdict? A corrupted configuration file in the secondary processing module, almost certainly caused by a power fluctuation that the surge protection had absorbed but not before the file write was interrupted. The fix was a partial configuration restore from backup. Mason had the backups. He always had the backups. This was something his old mentor at the rental company had told him on his first week. The job isn't glamorous and the equipment isn't perfect, and the only thing standing between you and a catastrophe is whether you made the backup. And Mason had taken it seriously enough that it was now reflex, the way checking your mirrors when you drive was reflex. He ran the restore. It took 11 minutes. At 6:22, the system came back clean. Darius walked in at 6:31, coffee in hand, and looked at the status lights. Clean, he said. Clean. Darius looked at him. You already fixed it. It's fixed. You could have waited for me. You needed the sleep. Darius sat down on a road case and drank his coffee with the expression of a man who'd been working with Mason long enough to know which arguments were worth having. One of these days you're going to let someone else handle something. I let you handle plenty. The stuff you've already decided doesn't need your specific attention. Darius took another sip. Not the same thing. Mason started logging the incident. Eli okay this morning? I didn't check on him. I did. He was asleep. I heard him talking in his sleep. About what? Something about a water feature. Darius shook his head. That kid is something else, man. Mason didn't say anything to that. He logged the incident, documented the fix, and sent the report to the client liaison before 6:45, with a brief explanation that a configuration issue had been identified and resolved before business hours, and that the system was running clean. No drama in the language, just the facts and the outcome. He got a reply from the client liaison at 8:02. Thank you for the quick resolution. Ms. Sterling has been notified. He wondered briefly who had notified her and what she'd said, and then stopped wondering about it because he had 3 final walkthroughs to complete before 9. The final morning ran well, the way things tended to run well when the equipment was sound, and the crew was experienced and everyone was in the rhythm of a job they'd been doing for 3 days. Mason was at the rear of the hall for the opening remarks, monitoring, and he was aware of Vanessa Sterling on the stage in the peripheral kind of way he was always aware of the primary presenter. Not focused attention, just a general consciousness of how the room was receiving the source. She spoke for 20 minutes to open the final day. She talked about what the conference was supposed to be, what she'd wanted it to be when she planned it 8 months ago, and whether she thought it had delivered on that. She was direct in a way that surprised the room. She named 2 things that hadn't worked as well as she'd hoped, not in the self-flagellating way of performed humility, just plainly, in the same tone she'd used to note a data point in a presentation. Then she said something that made Mason look up from his tablet. The most useful thing that happened to me this week, she said, didn't happen in this room. It happened in a conversation with someone who isn't in the industry, who doesn't know anything about Sterling Global's metrics or our growth projections, who had no agenda and wanted nothing from me. She paused. Those conversations are harder to have the more successful you become. I'd forgotten how much I missed them. She moved on. The room received it as a general reflection on leadership. Mason went back to his tablet. He wasn't sure if she'd meant him. He was about 60% sure she had. He thought about it for approximately 90 seconds and then filed it under things that were interesting but didn't require anything from him, and let it go. At 10:30 during the morning break, he was in the corridor outside room B recalibrating a wireless receiver when he heard his name. Not Mason. Mr. Reed. He turned. It was a man he didn't recognize. Late 40s, expensive suit, the particular kind of watch that was meant to be noticed. He was holding a coffee cup and looking at Mason with an expression that was politely assessing in a way Mason recognized as professionally trained, the controlled face of someone who spent a lot of time evaluating things and had learned not to show the evaluation. "That's me," Mason said. "I'm Philip Crane," the man said. "I'm on the board of Sterling Global." Mason waited. "I've heard you've had some conversations with Vanessa over the past couple of days," Philip Crane said. There was nothing overtly aggressive in the phrasing. It was the kind of sentence that was designed to be interpreted multiple ways, and Mason had dealt with enough corporate politics in event environments, not his own politics, but the ambient field of it that surrounded big conferences, to recognize the design. "I have," Mason said. "She speaks highly of you." Philip Crane smiled in a way that was technically a smile. "She mentioned you this morning in her remarks." "I heard." "She's an extraordinary person," Philip said. "Very focused. Sometimes that focus can be redirected by things that aren't central to the business." Another pause. "I say that as someone who supported her from the very beginning and wants to see Sterling Global continue to succeed." Mason looked at him for a moment. He understood what was happening. He'd seen versions of it before, the careful deployment of implied concern by someone with a specific interest in the outcome, the message wrapped in language that gave the speaker deniability. What Philip Crane was doing was warning him off without technically warning him off. He thought about several responses and chose the most straightforward one. "I install audio equipment," Mason said. "That's my job here. Ms. Sterling has been courteous. I don't think you need to worry about redirection." Philip Crane's smile maintained itself. "Of course not. I just think it's important that the people around Vanessa understand the context." "The context," Mason said. "She's in a critical period. There's a lot of pressure. The people in her orbit need to be," a slight pause, "aligned." "I'm not in her orbit," Mason said. "I'm fixing her microphones." He went back to the wireless receiver. After a moment, he heard Philip Crane's footsteps move away down the corridor. Mason finished the calibration, made the note in his log, and did not think particularly hard about the conversation. Philip Crane had a specific kind of power that operated through implication and social pressure, and it only worked if you gave it room to work. Mason didn't have anything to protect or position, which meant he didn't have anything to be threatened with. He did, however, think about what Crane had said about the board restructuring. The phone call Vanessa had referenced the previous night. Crane hadn't confirmed it was him, but the math was not complicated. He didn't do anything with that. It wasn't his math to do anything with. He checked on Eli at 11:15. The boy was in a state of high productivity. 3 new maps spread across the table, each one a different section of what had evidently become a larger, connected cartographic project. He'd been talking to Priya again, who had today explained the concept of a map legend, which Eli had immediately applied to all 3 maps in his own idiosyncratic symbol system. "The legend says this triangle means a place that's hard to get to," Eli explained, pointing to a small cluster of triangles in the upper corner of one map. "And this square means a place that looks good but isn't." Mason looked at the square symbol, which appeared several times across the maps in locations that seemed to correspond to the resort's main lobby, the pool area, and what he thought might be the conference hall. "Why does the conference hall look good but isn't?" Eli looked up at him with perfect seriousness. "It's too cold in there and the chairs are uncomfortable and nobody looks happy." Mason sat down. "Fair." "Dad," Eli put down his pencil. "There's a lady who came to talk to me." Mason stilled. What? In the hallway. When I went to the vending machine, she was nice. Eli picked his pencil back up. She had dark hair. She asked about my maps. What did you tell her? About the legend, and the dog section, and how the underground kingdom connects to this one. He pointed to one map. Through here. Mason sat with that for a second. Was Priya with you? I went by myself. It's just down the hall, Dad. I know. I've told you to let Priya know when you... I forgot. Eli said it with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who found the rule reasonable but had not considered it in the moment. She was really interested in the maps. She said the dog section was a very good idea. Yeah, Mason said. She mentioned that to me too. Eli looked up. You know her? A little. Eli studied his father for 3 full seconds with the particular intensity that children had when they were reading something adults thought they were hiding. Is she your friend? She's someone I've talked to a few times. Do you like her? She seems like a good person. Eli seemed to find this insufficient, but also not worth pressing. He went back to his map. She asked what I wanted to be when I grow up. What did you tell her? An explorer? He paused. Or someone who fixes things, like you. He made a mark on one of the maps, erased it, made it again smaller. She looked kind of sad when I said that. Sad why? Eli shrugged with one shoulder, the gesture he made when he'd observed something but couldn't explain it yet. I don't know, like the answer was something she didn't expect. Mason sat with his son for another 20 minutes and didn't say much, just watched him work, the pencil moving across paper in the quiet, focused way that was entirely Eli's own. He found Vanessa Sterling at lunch. Not intentionally. He was crossing the outdoor terrace level on his way to the South Service Bay, and she was at one of the small tables near the edge of the terrace, alone with a plate of food she was not eating, looking at her phone with the focused stillness of someone reading something difficult. He would have kept walking. She looked up. Mr. Reed? He stopped. Ms. Sterling. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her phone face down on the table, which he registered as deliberate. Sit down, she said. It was direct but not imperious, more like someone who'd run out of the energy for indirection. He sat. Your son told me about the connected maps, she said, the underground kingdom and the surface world. He mentioned you came to see him. I was looking for the stairwell, she said. I ended up at the vending machine. He was there. A pause. I don't normally talk to 7-year-olds. How was it? Surprisingly clarifying. She looked down at her untouched plate. He told me what he wants to be when he grows up, an explorer or someone who fixes things. He said like you, she said, like his father. She looked up. When did you realize that was happening? That he was watching you that closely? Mason thought about the honest answer. Probably when he was about 4. He'd started doing the thing where he repeated things I'd said, not in the way kids repeat phrases, but in situations where they were actually appropriate, applying them. He paused. It's a little alarming, honestly. You realize you have to mean what you do, not just say the right things. She was quiet. I fail at it regularly, he said. I lose my patience. I make decisions that are about what's easier for me and not what's better for him, and I usually know it when I'm doing it. I just do it anyway sometimes. He put his hands flat on the table. Parenting doesn't come with a clean version of yourself. Nothing does, she said, and there was something in it that sounded like it had been sitting with her for a while. Philip Crane talked to me this morning, Mason said. She went very still. In the corridor outside room B, he introduced himself, mentioned the conversations we'd been having, said he was concerned about you being redirected. The stillness became something else, not surprise, something harder. She'd known it was possible then, or at least hadn't ruled it out. What did you say? She asked. That I install audio equipment and he didn't need to worry about redirection. She looked at him for a long moment. He's been trying to replace my COO for 6 months, she said, under the pretense of structural efficiency. The COO in question is the person who built our data infrastructure and the person I trust most in the company. A pause. Philip knows that if I'm distracted or off balance, I'm more likely to accept a compromise I'd otherwise reject. Is it working? Not particularly. She said it steadily, without bravado, just an assessment. But it costs energy I'd rather spend on other things. Yeah. He looked at her. For what it's worth, Van. And I know it's not worth very much from someone who installs audio equipment. The version of you I've seen this week doesn't look like someone who's easy to manipulate. She looked at him for a moment. How much of that was a compliment? She asked. About half, he said. The other half was just an observation. She picked up her fork and actually ate something, the first thing she'd touched on the plate since he'd sat down. He wasn't sure what to make of that. My COO's name is Rachel, she said. She has 3 kids and a terrible taste in office furniture, and she once told a room of 20 investors that our growth projections were optimistic in a way that made 2 of them write bigger checks because they respected her for saying it. A pause. Philip thinks she's a liability because she tells me things I don't always want to hear. I think she's irreplaceable for the same reason. Is she going to be okay? Yes. Flat and certain. I decided that this morning, before the opening remarks. Mason nodded. I decided some other things this morning, too, she said, not elaborating. She ate another bite. He didn't push on it. They sat in a silence that was, he noticed, entirely comfortable, which was not a quality that silence usually had between people who had known each other for 2 days. Eli asked me to put a dog section in Sterling Global's lobby, she said. Mason closed his eyes briefly. He drew me a very specific diagram, she said, with dimensions. He doesn't really do vague. No. She looked like she was genuinely considering it. I'm not going to do it, but I thought about it for longer than I should have. He'll be disappointed. Tell him I'm keeping the diagram, she said, for the record. Mason looked at her. She wasn't performing the warmth. It was just there, less guarded than it had been at any point since the pool deck. He'd been watching it happen over 3 days, the layers coming off in no particular order, not because she'd decided to trust him specifically, but because he hadn't given her any reason to keep them on. Can I ask you something? He said. You've asked me things before, she said. I answered them. Do you have people around you who are just honest with you? Not adversarially, just straight. She thought about it without deflecting. Rachel, 2 or 3 others maybe. A pause. It gets smaller. The higher you go, the smaller it gets. Because people need things from you, or they're afraid of you, or they've decided your success depends on you staying in a particular frame of mind, and they don't want to mess with that. She set her fork down. Philip thinks he's one of those people. He's not. He's protecting a position. And Rachel is. Rachel is. Something in her face when she said it, not sentimentality, just the weight of something real. Mason nodded. He thought about Darius, who did the same thing for him in a different register. Not calling him out loudly, just present and honest in the small moments. The look that said you already fixed it and meant you need to stop carrying everything yourself. It's worth protecting, he said. I know. She looked at him steadily. It's what I've been forgetting. The outdoor terrace around them had filled and begun to empty again as the lunch break wound toward its end. Mason became aware of the time in the way he always became aware of it, not as urgency, just as fact. I have to go, he said. I know. She didn't say it with disappointment exactly, but with the acceptance of someone who'd made peace with the fact that the people she'd found interesting in her life always had somewhere else to be. He stood, picked up his kit bag. For what it's worth, he said, Rachel sounds like she knows what she's doing. Vanessa looked up at him. Something in the directness of it, the way she didn't soften it, didn't make it smaller or larger than it was. So do you, she said. He went back to work. The afternoon sessions ran clean. The DSP held. The wireless systems held. Darius ran the final breakdown schedule with the crew, and Mason walked each room one last time the way he always did. Not because he expected to find anything, but because it was his job and he finished what he started. At 5 o'clock, Eli found him in the main conference hall and announced that the connected map project was complete and that the resort had been fully redesigned and was now significantly better. Can I see it later? Mason asked. There are 17 maps, Eli said. It takes a while to explain. I've got time. Eli looked at the conference hall with its stage and its screens and its rows of chairs, the way his son looked at all spaces, not as they were, but as they could be. "Dad," he said, "this room would be better with windows." "Probably." "And the chairs are wrong." "That's been noted by multiple parties," Mason said. Eli nodded, satisfied that the record reflected the truth, and took his father's hand. The closing gala was scheduled for 7:30, and Mason had the rooftop terrace fully operational by 5:15. He walked it twice after the crew finished the setup, not because Darius hadn't done it correctly. Darius always did it correctly, but because it was the final event of the contract and Mason had a specific relationship with final events that required him to put his own eyes on everything one last time. He tested each speaker cluster individually. He confirmed the wireless mic charges, checked the backup batteries, ran a signal trace on every cable run. He found one loose XLR connection at the stage left monitor return, the same type of issue as the first morning, the same cause, the overnight HVAC vibration working on connectors that had been fine during the day. He fixed it, logged it, moved on. At 5:40, Claudia Reyes came out onto the terrace with a tablet and a coffee and the expression of someone in the final stretch of a long project who could see the finish line but wasn't going to relax until they crossed it. "How are we?" she said. "Good. One connection addressed, everything else clean." She walked the perimeter with him, ticking items on her checklist. She was efficient about it, no small talk, which Mason respected. At the far end of the terrace, she stopped and looked out over the desert in the amber late afternoon light. "You did good work this week," she said. "Your team made it easy," he said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. Claudia's operation was tight, and she knew it. "You always say something like that," she said, "because it's usually true." She turned and looked at him directly. "The DSP fault this morning. You had it resolved before 6:30. The client didn't even know there was a problem until it was already fixed." "That's the job." "That is the job," she agreed. "Most vendors do the job in a way that makes you very aware of how hard the job is. You do it in a way that makes it look easy." She paused. "I'm going to request you specifically for our next major event. I just wanted to say that to your face instead of just putting it in the paperwork." Mason looked at her. He thought about what Darius had said. You never let anyone give you anything, and made a deliberate effort. "Thank you," he said. "I'd like that." Claudia nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her tablet. Says, he got Eli fed and settled at 6. Room service, Eli's requested order being a grilled cheese with the crust cut off and apple slices, which the Meridian Grand's kitchen produced with the same attention they gave the $50 steaks in the main restaurant, a fact that impressed Mason more than he'd expected. Priya came at 6:30. Eli was in the middle of explaining the completed map project to her, all 17 sheets spread across the desk and the floor, a presentation he'd clearly been preparing since the afternoon. "How long does the explanation take?" Mason asked Priya quietly at the door. "Last time it was 45 minutes, Priya said, "but he's added material." "I'll pay you for the full evening." "I genuinely enjoy it," she said, and said it in the flat tone of someone stating an unlikely fact that happened to be true. Mason kissed the top of Eli's head. Eli was mid-explanation and barely registered it, just tilted his head toward his father automatically the way he did, and went to work. The closing gala had a different energy than the previous nights. Last nights of conferences always did. The pressure was off. Or a different kind of pressure was on, the kind that came with endings and evaluations, and the particular looseness of people who'd been performing competence for 3 days and were now at the edge of not having to. The crowd on the rooftop terrace was more relaxed, louder, better. The desert sky had that thing going on again, the deep blue going black in the east while the horizon in the west still held on to the last copper orange of the day, and the ambient temperature had dropped to a perfect evening warmth. Mason was at his station near the primary speaker stack monitoring when the closing program started at 8:30. 3 speakers, brief remarks each, the format designed to feel like a conclusion rather than a continuation. The first 2 were competent and conventional. Vanessa Sterling was third. She came to the podium and stood there for a moment without speaking, which was a choice, not a hesitation, a choice. She let the room get quiet in its own time rather than calling for it. I want to tell you something I learned this week, she said. Not from a panel, not from a keynote, from a conversation. She paused. Someone told me that the reason his company has an 89% client retention rate is that they finish what they start. And when I asked if there was more to it than that, he said, the secret is that most companies don't actually do that. So when you do, you stand out. The room was quiet. I've been running Sterling Global for 8 years, she said. I know our retention metrics. I know our NPS scores. I know our analyst ratings. And I sat there listening to that and thought, when did I stop thinking about it that simply? When did we start measuring everything except the thing that actually matters, which is whether we finish what we start? She let it sit for a moment. I don't have an answer to that tonight, she said, but I'm going to spend some time looking for one. She looked out over the crowd. Thank you for this week. I mean that in a more complicated way than it usually gets said. She stepped back from the podium. The applause was genuine in the way applause was genuine when it was slightly surprised at itself. From his station at the far end of the terrace, Mason watched the room. He kept his face neutral. He was aware of Darius 2 positions over, not looking at him with the deliberateness of someone choosing not to look, which was essentially the same as looking. He checked his signal levels. Everything was clean. The gala wound down the way galas did, gradually, in small clusters of departure, the caterers beginning their quiet service of clearing that signaled to everyone that the evening had reached its natural edge. Mason ran his crew through the first stage of breakdown, the items that could come down safely while guests were still present, the ones that were purely structural and not running live. He worked alongside them rather than directing from a distance, which was habit and also preference. He found that the work went better when he was in it. He was coiling cable near the stage when one of Vanessa Sterling's colleagues, a woman he'd seen in the conference hall throughout the week, mid-40s, efficient movement, the kind of person who seemed to always know where the exit was, stopped nearby. Mr. Reed, she said. He looked up. I'm Karen Holt, Vanessa's chief of staff. She said it simply, no performance in it. She'd like to speak with you before you finish up, if that's possible. Where? The north end of the terrace. She'll be there in about 10 minutes. He nodded and went back to the cable. Darius was right beside him, winding his own coil, eyes on his work. You want me to cover the breakdown? He said, conversationally. I'll be back in 10, Mason said. Right, Darius said. 10 minutes? Mason handed him the cable and walked to the north end of the terrace. It was the quietest section of the roof now, the last of the guests clustered toward the elevator lobby, the catering team working the other end. The railing here faced directly north, which meant it looked out at the pure desert. No resort lighting, no highway in this direction, just the dark expanse going out to the horizon and the sky overhead, doing its full work. Vanessa Sterling was already there, her back to the room, looking out. She'd changed out of the formal dress from the gala into something simpler, dark slacks, a jacket against the cooler night air, her hair pulled back. She looked like herself, Mason thought, more than she'd looked during any of the conference's public moments, which probably said something about what the conference's public moments required. You used what I said, Mason said, coming to stand beside her. I did. She turned to look at him. I should have asked. You don't need my permission to repeat something. It was your thought. It's not a proprietary thought. He looked out at the desert. Plenty of people have said it before me. Not to me, she said. They stood there for a moment. The wind was low, barely enough to register, and the desert was making its night sounds. Nothing dramatic, just the small settling of temperature and the distant movement of things that lived out there. Philip Crane left early, she said. He had a flight. Good. He's going to be a problem for another few months, she said, and then he's not going to be on the board anymore. She said it without satisfaction, just as a statement of trajectory. I've been too patient with the situation. This week helped me see that. How? She thought about it. Because I watched you deal with problems at the source, quietly, without a lot of conversation about it. The DSP this morning, the wind issue on the second day. You just resolved things. She paused. I've been having the same conversation with Philip for 6 months and treating it like a negotiation that might still go somewhere. It's not. I've known it's not. Sometimes it takes a while to trust what you already know, he said. Yes. She said it in a way that suggested she was annoyed at herself for the delay, but the annoyance was clean, directed, not consuming. Can I ask you something? She said. You've asked me things before, he said. I answered them. He was aware, as he said it, that he was giving her her own line back. She noticed. When I came through the service door the other night, she said, why did you stay and talk to me? You could have pointed me toward the main corridor and been done. He thought about the honest answer. You seemed like you needed to be somewhere that wasn't the event, he said, and the service corridor was the place you'd ended up, which usually means something. That's very generous, she said. Not really. I was curious too. She looked at him. About you, he said. Not about what I'd heard about you. About who you actually were when the event was over. He paused. Those are different people sometimes. And what did you find out? That you walk barefoot on cold floors and you don't know which way the resort's east wing faces, and you genuinely considered putting a dog section in your company lobby. He kept his voice level. And that you're harder on yourself than anyone else is, and you have people worth protecting, and you don't stop working even when you're exhausted. She was quiet. Is that accurate? He asked. Uncomfortably, she said. Below them, somewhere on the resort grounds, a door closed. Someone laughed. The sounds of an event finishing, the ordinary sounds. Eli showed me the maps this afternoon, Vanessa said. All 17 of them. Mason looked at her. He showed you. He found me during the afternoon break. He had a rolled tube under one arm and a very specific expression. She paused. He said you told him I was someone who might understand them. Mason had, in fact, said something close to that. He hadn't expected Eli to act on it so directly. He's not shy, Mason said. No. She said it was something that was almost fond. He walked me through the entire connected world. The underground kingdom, the surface map, the resort redesign, the airport with the dog section. She paused. He told me the squares on the legend mean places that look good but aren't. He put squares on the conference hall. And on the lobby of what he imagined Sterling Global's headquarters looked like, she said, based on a photograph on my Wikipedia page, apparently. Mason thought about how to respond to that and settled on not responding to it directly. What did you tell him? He asked. That he should become a cartographer, she said. He told me that was just a job title for explorer. She looked out at the desert. He's going to be remarkable. He already is, Mason said. I just try to stay out of his way. You don't, she said. Stay out of his way. You're in everything he does, the way he explains things, the way he thinks about what things are for. She turned to look at him. He told me the best maps aren't the ones that show you what's there. They're the ones that show you where you could go. Mason was quiet. He said you told him that, she said. He had. About 8 months ago, sitting on the floor of their apartment with Eli's first map spread between them, when Eli had asked why the maps in his geography workbook were boring. Mason had said it without thinking, the way he said most things to Eli, just honestly, not wondering whether it was good enough or smart enough or the right thing to say to a 6-year-old. He remembered it better than I did, Mason said. That's what children do with the things that matter, she said. The terrace was nearly empty now. The catering team had cleared most of the tables and Mason's crew was deep into the breakdown, the ambient speaker clusters already down, the cable runs being pulled. He could see Darius moving with the practiced ease of someone ending a job well. I need to get back, Mason said. I know. She didn't move immediately. Mason. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He registered it without showing that he had. I want to say something and I need you to just hear it and not do anything with it, she said. He waited. The past 3 days have been the most honest I've felt in a long time, she said. Not because of the conference, because of the conversations I've had, mostly with you, and once at length with a 7-year-old who takes geographic integrity very seriously. She paused. I don't say that to make you responsible for it. I say it because it's true, and I think you deserve to hear it. He looked at her. I hear it, he said. Good. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and straightened slightly. The specific posture she moved into when she was closing something out rather than leaving it open, he'd learned to recognize it. I'm going to be in Phoenix in 6 weeks. Site visit for a potential acquisition. Sterling Global is looking at a mid-size infrastructure firm based there. He waited. I wondered if you and Eli would have dinner with me, she said. Not a business dinner, not a networking thing, just dinner. A pause. You could bring the maps. He looked at her for a moment. The honest answer, which he went with, was, I'd have to check with Eli. He has opinions about restaurants. Something in her face released, not dramatically, just a small easing of something that had been held carefully. Tell him I'll accept his criteria, she said. He'll want to know if there's a window view. I'll request it specifically. And good chairs. She laughed. The third time he'd heard that laugh, the real one, the one that surprised her. I'll make it a requirement. He nodded. He stood there for one moment longer than he needed to, and it was the moment that said what neither of them was going to say right now, which was that this was something, even if neither of them knew yet what kind of something it was. Then he went back to his crew. He worked alongside Darius and June and Tomas for the next hour and 40 minutes, breaking down the rig with the systematic efficiency of people who'd done it many times and knew the sequence. Equipment cases packed in load order, cable coiled correctly without the lazy over-under that caused problems 6 months later when someone found the coil had kinked. Labels confirmed against the inventory list. He helped the resort's overnight staff move the last of the furniture that the gala had displaced. Chairs back to their storage configuration, tables folded, the decorative elements that the resort owned stacked in the order the morning team would expect them. He held the service elevator for a staff member pushing a heavy cart of glassware, and then held it again for one of the kitchen workers coming up with a supply run. And both times he stood to the side without making it a gesture, just moved out of the way and let them through. He fixed a snapped buckle on one of the equipment cases with a spare piece of hardware from his kit bag. It wasn't his case, it was the resort's AV rental, but the broken buckle would be a problem for whoever loaded it next, and it took Mason 40 seconds to fix. He found a set of keys on the terrace floor under where one of the high tops had been, and he took them to the front desk rather than leaving them with the event staff, because the front desk had a lost and found system and the event staff did not. He did none of these things for any particular reason. They were just the things that needed doing. Vanessa Sterling did not see any of them. She had gone back inside after their conversation, pulled by Karen Holt and what was apparently a call that needed to happen before midnight. She was somewhere in the resort, in a suite or a conference room or a service corridor. Mason didn't know, and it wasn't relevant. What she didn't see was the version of him that was here now, this late, doing the work that the end of the job required. Not because she was gone, not because anyone was watching or not watching, just because this was who he was in the intervals between the moments that mattered, and the intervals were where most of it actually happened. By 11:15, the terrace was clean, the equipment was in the loading bay staged for the morning truck, and Mason had signed off on the site log. He stood in the loading bay for a moment, rolling his shoulders, taking stock of the particular physical tiredness that came from 3 days of early mornings and late nights. It wasn't a bad tiredness. It was the kind that came from having actually done something. Darius leaned against a road case nearby, looking at his phone. June was already gone. She had a 4-hour drive ahead of her and had left at 11 sharp. Tomas was finishing the load manifest. Good run, Darius said without looking up. Yeah, Mason said. When's the Phoenix thing? Next Thursday. I'll be there. Mason looked at him. I know. Darius glanced up from his phone. You good? It was not a question about whether he was physically okay. Mason understood the question. Yeah, he said. I'm good. He picked up his kit bag and went upstairs to his son. Eli was asleep when Mason got back to the room, but not deeply. The boy stirred when Mason came through the door, turned over, and said, Dad. In the flat, certain way he said it when he was 3/4 asleep and just needed to confirm the fact of his father's presence before going back under. Yeah, Mason said. It's me. Eli settled. Mason sat at the desk for a while without turning on the lamp. The room was dark except for the strip of light under the bathroom door that they kept on, because Eli didn't like waking up to complete darkness. It was enough to see by, barely. Mason could make out the shape of his son in the bed, the arm thrown out sideways the way it always was, and the desk beside him where the 17 maps were stacked carefully in their rolled tube, ready for transport. He thought about what Vanessa had said. The best maps aren't the ones that show you what's there. They're the ones that show you where you could go. He'd said it once, offhand, sitting on a floor with a 6-year-old and a piece of paper, and his son had kept it. Had carried it around for 8 months, and then handed it back to a woman Mason had known for 3 days as though it were important enough to pass on. Children did that. Took the things you said in the unguarded moments and turned them into something more permanent than you'd meant them to be. It was terrifying sometimes. It was also the closest thing Mason knew to legacy. He thought about Sarah. He didn't do it as often as he used to, not because he'd stopped missing her, but because the grief had changed shape over 3 years, become less like an open wound and more like a changed landscape, something you moved through rather than something that stopped you. He thought about her the way he thought about her most often now, which was in the context of Eli. In the specific ways the boy was entirely hers, the single shoulder shrug, the flat certainty, the way he formed attachments quickly and completely and without apparent fear. He thought about what she would have made of this week. She would have asked about Vanessa Sterling with the specific directness that had been one of the things he'd loved most about her, and also occasionally found the most difficult to navigate. Not jealousy, never really jealousy, just the pure blunt interest in the truth of things. She would have said, "So what is she actually like?" Not as a question, as an invitation to stop performing and just tell her. And he would have said, "She's real under the surface. It takes a while to get there, but it's real." And Sarah would have nodded once, satisfied, and said, "Good." He opened his laptop and wrote the final event report. It took 40 minutes, thorough, documented, the kind of report that told the full story of the job without editorializing. He sent it to the client liaison, copied Darius, archived the file. Then he closed the laptop and went to sleep. They checked out at 8:30 the next morning. Eli carried his own bag, which was a rule Mason had established when Eli turned 6, and which Eli upheld with variable enthusiasm, depending on his level of tiredness and the distance from the room to the vehicle. This morning he was fully awake, which meant the bag stayed on his shoulder without complaint, and he walked beside Mason through the resort's main lobby with the particular alertness of someone cataloging details for future map revisions. "The lobby is better than I thought," Eli said, looking around. "Then your map?" "I didn't do the lobby. I ran out of time." He considered it. "It needs a different floor. The marble is too shiny, makes it loud." "That's a good observation." "It also needs plants, more plants, big ones." "I'll note that for management." Eli looked up at him. "You're joking." "Slightly." At the front desk, Mason settled the final account. Their room charges, the incidentals, the room service grilled cheese, and the young man behind the desk processed it efficiently and said, "Mr. Reed, there's something here for you," and handed him an envelope with his name written on the front in a clear, direct hand. Mason looked at it. "When did this arrive?" he asked. "It was left with night services," the young man said, "with instructions to give it to you at checkout." Mason put it in his jacket pocket. Eli was watching him with the expression that meant he'd noticed but was deciding whether to ask. He decided to ask. "What's that?" "Don't know yet." "Are you going to open it?" "Later." Eli accepted this with the patience he produced when Mason's tone suggested the subject was closed for now, which was a patience Mason had spent actual time cultivating, mostly by being consistent about the boundary between later meaning actually later and later meaning never. Eli had learned to trust the former because Mason tried to mean it. They loaded the truck. Eli buckled himself in. He'd been doing it independently for about a year, another threshold Mason had noted and not made a production of. And Mason started the engine. The morning desert was already warm, the sky a deep clear blue that suggested nothing of the 100-degree afternoon coming, and the resort receded in the rear view as he pulled out onto the access road. "Dad?" Eli said, about 3 miles out. "Yeah." "The lady with the dark hair, is she nice?" Mason kept his eyes on the road. Yeah, she is. Nice like Priya nice? Or nice like people at your work nice? This was a meaningful distinction. Priya nice meant genuinely, without agenda. People at work nice was a category Eli had invented at age 5 to describe the courtesy that lived in professional contexts and wasn't exactly dishonest, but wasn't personal either. Somewhere in between, Mason said, and then reconsidered. Maybe more on the Priya side. Eli nodded slowly. She listened about the maps, he said. Not like she was being polite, like she actually wanted to know. Yeah, Mason said. She's like that. The squares on her building, Eli said. I wasn't trying to be mean. She knew that. Okay. He looked out the window at the desert going past. Can we still do the train thing Saturday? Still on. Eli settled back in his seat with the resolution of someone whose priorities had just been confirmed. He was asleep by the time they hit the highway, the same way he fell asleep every time they drove. Suddenly, completely, the way children were able to simply stop being awake. His head tilted toward the window, one hand loosely open on his knee. Mason drove and did not open the envelope yet. He drove for about an hour, the desert flattening out around him into the long, straight stretch that connected the resort area to the Phoenix suburbs. And he thought without particularly organizing his thoughts about the job, about the DSP fault and the wind call and the morning by the pool, about Philip Crane's careful smile, about Vanessa at the rooftop railing, about the service corridor, about the lobby's marble floor that was too shiny and too loud, about 17 maps stacked in a tube in the back seat. He thought about the fact that his life had a shape to it that he hadn't designed exactly but had built, decision by decision, over the past 3 years since everything that had previously had a shape fell apart, and that the shape wasn't a finished thing. There were structural issues, things he kept meaning to address, the drainage problem and the alternator noise being the literal versions of larger categories. But it held. It held because he'd put in the work to make it hold. He pulled into a gas station outside of Chandler to fill the tank. He did it quietly, not waking Eli. While the gas ran, standing outside the truck in the early heat with one hand on the door, he opened the envelope. It was a handwritten note, 3 paragraphs, on hotel stationery. The handwriting was the same clear, direct hand as the outside of the envelope. Mason, I don't write letters. I want to note that up front so you understand what this one cost me. I came to the Meridian Grand this week expecting to deliver a conference and leave. I've done that at least 15 times in the past 5 years, and I knew the shape of it, what I'd give, what I'd take away, what I'd have to manage, and how. This week didn't go the shape I expected, and I find myself at checkout thinking about a pool deck at 5:50 in the morning and a service corridor that smelled like cleaning solution and a 17-part map of a world that doesn't exist yet. You asked me once if I had people who were honest with me. I do. Rachel is one of them, and I'm going back to protect that. But I want you to know that you're the most straightforwardly decent person I've met in a long time, and I don't think you know it because I don't think you spend time thinking about it that way. You just do the thing. You just are the thing. And watching that for 3 days reminded me of something I'd let myself forget, which is that the way you behave when nobody important is watching is the most accurate description of who you are. Tell Eli his maps are exceptional. Tell him the square is correct. Dinner in Phoenix. I mean it. V. Mason folded the note and put it back in the envelope. The gas pump clicked off. He replaced the nozzle, got back in the truck, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. He thought about the most accurately description of who you are. He thought about whether that was true. He thought about the broken buckle he'd fixed on someone else's equipment case, and the keys he'd brought to the front desk, and the way he'd stood in Eli's doorway at 4:15 every morning, listening to his son breathe, and whether any of those things made him the person she'd described, or whether they just made him someone going through his day. He didn't arrive at a definitive answer. He wasn't sure there was one. He thought that probably the point wasn't to decide whether you were a good person and then coast. The point was to keep doing the things that were required of you, day after day, in the specific unglamorous intervals where it didn't matter whether anyone saw, and there was no reward for it except that the thing got done. He thought about Sarah again, briefly, about the specific way she'd had of calling him out when he was performing selflessness rather than practicing it. You're being good at you right now. Not actually good. There's a difference. And how much he'd hated hearing it, and how right she'd been. He still caught himself doing it sometimes. The performance. It was a hard habit to fully break. He thought Vanessa Sterling probably caught herself doing it too, in different ways, in different contexts. He thought that was part of what the week had been about for her. The effort of finding the version of herself that wasn't performing. He started the truck and pulled back onto the road. They got home to Phoenix at 11:20. Their apartment was on the second floor of a building in a neighborhood that had been in the process of becoming something better for the past 4 years and was taking its time about it. It was not a glamorous building. The drainage issue Mason needed to follow up on was in the exterior stairwell, where a poorly graded section of concrete channeled rainwater into the corner of the landing instead of out toward the street. It wasn't dangerous, just a nuisance, the kind of thing that got logged with the property manager and then required 3 follow-up calls before anything happened. Mason noted it as they climbed the stairs. He'd make the call Monday. Eli went straight to his room and began the process of integrating the resort maps into the larger cartographic project that lived on his bedroom wall. A slowly expanding geography that had started 2 years ago with a single hand-drawn map of their neighborhood and had grown into something that now occupied most of the wall above his desk, connected with small penciled lines and notations in his own symbol system. Mason stood in the doorway and watched him work. The maps on the wall were not accurate in any conventional sense. Streets bent where Eli thought they should bend. Buildings were scaled to their importance rather than their size. Their apartment building was drawn larger than the grocery store 2 blocks away, which was drawn larger than the bank across the street, which barely appeared at all. The resort would go in somewhere near the right edge of the current map, Mason guessed, in whatever position Eli decided corresponded to its emotional geography rather than its physical one. "Dad," Eli said, without turning around, "can I use the good tape?" "Where is it?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking you." Mason found it in the kitchen junk drawer and brought it in. Eli was already measuring out where the first resort map would go, holding it against the wall with one hand, his head tilted at the specific angle he used when making aesthetic decisions. "A little lower," Mason said. Eli moved it down. "Here?" "Yeah." Eli taped it, stepped back, studied it, moved 2 inches to the right, studied it again. "Better," he said to himself. Mason watched him work for another few minutes, the particular pleasure of watching someone do something they were genuinely suited for, the way Eli moved between the maps with absolute confidence in the geography of his own imagined world. "Eli," he said. Vanessa, the lady with the dark hair. She said to tell you your maps are exceptional." Eli paused in his work. He turned around, which was not something he did easily when he was mid-project. "She did?" "She also said the square is correct." Eli's expression went through several things quickly. Something that was surprise, and something that was satisfaction, and something else that was harder to name. A kind of recognition, maybe, the specific feeling of having been understood by someone you'd been uncertain about. "Okay," he said. "She wants to have dinner with us in a few weeks. In Phoenix." Eli turned back to his wall. He reached for the next map, aligned it, considered. "Does she know about good restaurants?" "She said she'd look into it. She knows you have criteria." "Window view," Eli said, "and real chairs, not the ones that look good but aren't." "I told her." Eli taped the second map into place. He studied the emerging section of wall. The resort maps were going in the lower right corner, their connection to the rest of the geography still to be determined. "Is she going to be our friend?" he asked. Mason thought about the real answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "Maybe." "Okay," Eli said, which meant he was filing it as possible and was willing to wait for more information. It was a mature response for a 7-year-old. It was, Mason thought, better than the response most adults gave to uncertainty. The phone call with Rachel Nguyen happened 3 days after Mason got home. He hadn't expected it. He was in the middle of the drainage follow-up call with the property manager, which was, predictably, requiring more patience than it should have, when his phone showed an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail, finished the property manager call with the result that someone would look at it by end of week, which Mason translated in his head as 2 weeks, and then listened to the voicemail. Mr. Reed, my name is Rachel Nguyen. I'm the COO of Sterling Global. I'm calling on behalf of myself, not on behalf of the company. I want to be clear about that. Vanessa told me about your conversations at the Meridian Grand. She also told me what you said to Philip Crane and what you did and didn't do in that interaction. I wanted to call and say thank you. I know that's unusual. I just think the people who do the right thing in the small moments deserve to hear that it was noticed. Have a good evening. Mason listened to it twice. He thought about calling back and decided against it. What would he say? The message was complete in itself. She'd said what she'd meant to say clearly without requiring a response. Calling back would be adding something that didn't need to be added. He saved the voicemail. He didn't tell anyone about it. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed an audience. On Saturday, he took Eli to the model railroad exhibit at the Arizona Heritage Museum, which occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse in the Central District and had, it turned out, an exceptional window view from the upper floor, the full downtown skyline on one side and the desert foothills on the other, which Eli noted with the specific satisfaction of someone whose criteria had been unexpectedly exceeded. They spent 3 hours there. Eli had questions about the engineering that Mason could answer and questions about the history that Mason could not, and a docent named Harold, who was somewhere north of 70 and had been volunteering at the exhibit for 11 years, answered the historical questions with the depth of someone for whom this was not a hobby, but a genuine area of scholarship. Eli listened to Harold with the same focused intensity he brought to everything he actually cared about, and Harold responded to being listened to that way the way people always responded to Eli's attention, which was by giving more than they'd planned to. Mason stood to one side and watched his son and the old man bend over the same model layout and talk about the engineering decisions behind a particular mountain pass configuration. And he thought about the specific luck of having a kid who moved through the world this way, openly, without the defensive armor that most people accumulated, the genuine curiosity that hadn't yet learned to protect itself. He thought, don't mess that up. It was the thought he'd been having in various forms since Eli was 4. It wasn't a thought about fear exactly, more about attention. Pay attention. Don't get so busy with the work of keeping things together that you stop watching what's actually happening in front of you. He thought he mostly managed it. He thought he'd fail at it more as Eli got older and the parenting got more complicated. He thought the goal wasn't to not fail. It was to be the kind of person who noticed when he did and corrected. On the drive home, Eli was quiet for a long time, looking out the window with the expression of someone processing a large amount of new information. "Dad," he said eventually. "Yeah." Harold said the best model railroads aren't the ones that are perfectly accurate. They're the ones that capture how it felt to be there. Mason looked at the road. He said, "Accuracy is easy," Eli continued. "You just measure things, but feeling is hard. You have to decide what matters." "What did you think about that?" Eli was quiet for a moment. "I think that's what I've been doing," he said. "With the maps. I just didn't have the words for it." Mason drove. "Is that okay?" Eli asked. "That the maps aren't accurate?" "I think Harold would say they're more accurate than the accurate ones." Eli considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." Vanessa Sterling called on a Tuesday evening, 6 days after the conference ended. Mason was washing dishes when his phone rang, and he answered it with a wet hand, leaning against the kitchen counter, and she said hi, without preamble, in the slightly different register of someone calling a person rather than conducting business. There was background noise on her end, office sounds, the ambient hum of a building. "Hi," he said. "I'm in San Francisco right now, site visit. I fly to Phoenix Thursday evening." A pause. "I wanted to confirm dinner before I gave Eli's criteria to the reservations team." That sentence is going to mean a lot to him. It should. He was very specific. He could hear the almost smile in her voice. Window view facing north or east, not marble floors or any floor with significant echo. Chairs with actual back support. And I want you to know I confirmed this before calling, a menu that includes something with chicken that isn't complicated. Mason was quiet for a moment. "He gave you a written list," he said. He handed it to Karen when I wasn't looking. She scanned it and sent it to me. A pause. Your son is extremely organized. He has a system. I noticed. Her voice had the quality it had in the service corridor. The layers off, just the direct register underneath. How are you? Genuinely. He thought about the honest answer. Good. The alternator on my truck is going to need work. The property manager finally agreed to fix the stairwell drainage. Eli spent 45 minutes today explaining Harold to me, which required me to also learn a lot about model railroad history. Harold, docent at a museum we went to Saturday. They had a very significant conversation. About what? The difference between accuracy and truth, Mason said, as applied to scale models. A moment of quiet on the line. I like that, she said. The difference between accuracy and truth. Eli's going to put it in his legend system somewhere. I'm not sure how yet. She laughed. The real laugh across 400 miles of phone line. It sounded the same. Thursday, she said. I'll have Karen send you the restaurant details when we confirm. What time? 7. Is that okay for Eli? He'll manage. If he has additional criteria, she said, have him give them to me directly. I've established that's more efficient. Mason smiled at the kitchen window. I'll let him know the channel is open. Good. A brief pause. A different quality in it. The pause of someone who had said the practical things and was deciding about the other thing. I'm looking forward to it, she said. I want you to know that, not as a courtesy. I know, he said. Me too. He thought, after they hung up, about the shape of things, not the future. He was a person who'd learned the hard way that the future had too many variables to spend too much time projecting into. More about the present. The current shape of this specific thing. A woman who moved through the world at significant velocity and had, for 3 days in a desert, stopped moving quite that fast. A man who moved through the world at a steadier and less visible pace and had, for the same 3 days, been seen by someone who wasn't used to looking at what he was looking at. There was no guarantee it led anywhere lasting. He knew that. She knew that. They were different people with different lives, and the dinner on Thursday was a dinner, not a destination, and whatever happened next would happen next without anyone being able to map it in advance. But here was the thing Mason had learned, the thing that 3 years of doing it alone had taught him in the way that experience taught things. Not gently, not in a single clean lesson, but repeatedly, in the ordinary moments that accumulated until you couldn't not know it. Most of what actually mattered happened in the intervals, not in the keynote address or the closing gala or the moment someone famous said something quotable about success. In the interval between the alarm going off and the door closing, in the note left on a nightstand, in the fixing of the buckle on someone else's equipment case, in the turning away at the pool and the holding out of a towel without making it a performance, in the 45 minutes explaining Harold to your father on a Tuesday afternoon. In the 17 maps on a bedroom wall that documented a whole imagined world, scaled not to accuracy but to what felt important. The small things were not small because they were unimportant. They were small because they were close. The closer something was, the harder it was to see its actual size. He thought about Vanessa in the service corridor, with her shoes in her hand, barefoot on the cold tiles, looking at a part of a building she'd never been in before. He thought about what it cost someone like her to walk through a door she hadn't planned for, to let herself be somewhere unexpected, to stop and talk to a person who wasn't in her orbit and didn't need anything from her. He thought it probably cost more than most people would have imagined. He thought she'd pay it anyway. He'd seen enough of her now to believe that. When she decided something mattered, she went toward it without the elaborate hedging that protected people from being wrong. It was, he thought, the same quality that had built her company and made Philip Crane nervous and kept Rachel Nguyen in her COO seat against the kind of pressure that would have made a lesser founder fold. She went toward things. She committed. He was different, slower to get there, more given to caution, the particular carefulness of someone who'd had the future rearranged without notice and knew what that cost. But he got there. He dried his hands and put the dishes away. He checked Eli's room. The boy was at his desk, adding something to the lower right corner of the wall map, the resort geography being integrated into the larger world with the careful pencil work that Eli brought to everything he cared about. The room smelled like pencil, and the slightly stale sweetness of the crayon case that was always open somewhere. "Dinner Thursday," Mason said from the doorway. 7 o'clock. She's requesting your additional criteria directly, if you have any. Eli turned around. "Her number?" "I'll get you her assistant's email." Eli nodded, considering. "I have 2 more things," he said. "Of course you do. Tablecloths. Not the paper kind, the real ones." He turned back to his map. "And I want to be able to see the kitchen from the table, or at least know it exists." Mason looked at his son. "Why the kitchen?" Eli picked up his pencil. "Because a restaurant is more honest when you can see where the food comes from," he said, as though this were obvious. Vanessa would understand that. Mason stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought, yeah, she probably would. "I'll pass it along," he said. He turned off the hall light on his way to the kitchen to make coffee, leaving Eli to his maps and his geography of the things that mattered, the world he was building out of paper and pencil, and the particular certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to be uncertain about what deserved to be seen. Outside the apartment window, Phoenix was doing what Phoenix did in the early evening in June. The heat beginning its slow reduction, the light changing, the city settling into a different kind of busy than the daytime one. Not quieter, exactly, just differently pitched. Mason poured his coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and did not do anything productive for a few minutes. He just sat there and let the day be what it was. The ordinary weight of it, the specific texture of a life that was not remarkable from the outside but felt, from the inside, like exactly enough. He thought about what Eli had said in the truck after the museum, that the best maps weren't the accurate ones. That accuracy was easy, that feeling was hard, that you had to decide what mattered. He thought that was, actually, the whole thing. The whole lesson that he kept learning and kept needing to learn again in different forms. That life didn't reward you for measuring it correctly. It rewarded you for knowing what to measure. For standing in front of a wall covered in hand-drawn maps of imagined places and understanding that what you were looking at was not a child's project, but a genuine act of meaning-making, a kid deciding what the world should be and putting it on paper with enough conviction that it started to feel true. He thought about a woman standing at a pool's edge in the dark, being unexpectedly seen by someone who had no reason to look away and every social permission not to, and what it did to a person to be treated with simple decency in the moment they were most unprepared for it. He thought about the fact that the most important things that had ever happened to him had not announced themselves as important when they were happening. They had looked like a morning. They had looked like a conversation in a service corridor. They had looked like a note folded into an envelope and handed over a front desk by a man who didn't know what it contained. The coffee was too hot to drink yet. He held the mug anyway, warming his hands, looking at the middle distance. On the bedroom wall, Eli was penciling in the roads that would connect the desert resort to the rest of his world, deciding where the lines went, what led where, which paths were worth drawing, and which were the kind that looked good on paper but didn't actually take you anywhere. He was very careful about those distinctions. He'd learned that from somewhere.